Well, good morning. My name is Amanda Schnetzer, and I'm the Director of Global Initiatives at the Bush Institute in Dallas. New York was actually my home from 1999 to 2003. Some of those were difficult days, but I can tell you that the spirit of liberty never wavered here, and it's alive and kicking today. So thank you for hosting us in this city today. This session is about naming threats to liberty in the world today. Some are old, some are new. But this session is mostly about turning our attention as a nation to action and getting things done. And at the core, it's about affirming the imperative of American leadership. To help us explore these issues, we have three distinguished leaders who really need no introduction. But for the record, I'm joined on the stage by Nikki Haley, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, the 64th U.S. Secretary of State and Chair of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and Condoleezza Rice, the 66th U.S. Secretary of State. It's going to be hard for me to say Madam Secretary on this stage today, so I'm going to try to mix it up a little bit and make sure we know with whom we're chatting. So, shall we begin? I think we'll start with the first piece that I mentioned and simply name the threats that we have in the world today. And they're serious. Nuclear weapons in North Korea, the brutality of ISIS, Russia's aggression in Europe, China's aggression in Asia, and more. All of these threats attack the values and institutions that have energized America's growth as a nation and have contributed to spreading the spirit of liberty abroad. Ambassador Haley, let's begin with you. How is the United States prioritizing these traditional threats in the world and to our nation, and what should American leadership look like, whether at the UN or through our alliances, in order to address them?
Well, thank you. And first I want to thank President and Mrs. Bush for having us here today. Putting me in between these two cool women is probably like the biggest highlight. So thank you very much. And Grace Jo, you inspire us so much. You are the reason we fight for what we fight for. So thank you very, very much. You know, we do have a lot of threats, but we also have to remember that leadership matters. So our biggest threats, obviously, North Korea, Iran, ISIS. Those are the three, because we have to always make sure we're doing everything we can to protect Americans and our allies. So we'll continue on that front. But then you have so many other issues. When you look at the migration problems that we have, and you see the human rights abuses that are happening, whether it's in Burma, whether we're seeing what's happening in Venezuela, in Cuba, all of those things, they matter too, because if any government doesn't take care of their people, conflict will follow. Human rights is such a clear part of what we have to do. And then you have to look at China and Russia as major players. Russia can't necessarily win anything. They don't have a big enough military. They don't have a strong economy. So they insert themselves in every situation to create chaos. China is doing what they do best. They are business people. They are making sure they have infrastructure all over the world. So they're making sure they have a stance in there. And the United States needs to be above all of that. We need to make sure we're watching our threats. We need to make sure that we continue to lead in every aspect. And we always have to just be true to who we are as Americans.
Dr. Rice?
I would agree completely. You've listed the threats and the crises, and I think it's clear that the international system feels not just chaotic, but indeed dangerous. And I'm really glad you are where you are, Ambassador. You're doing a terrific job. And let me just again, I think that Grace Jo gave us the testimony that we need at the core of what we're talking about here. I do want to say, I think the threats are more complex, they're more difficult. I think that the nature of social media and the rapidity of communication makes it more difficult than when I was there or when Madeleine was there. But I think we need also to recognize that the United States has done this before. It could not have looked as if we were going to get to 1989, 1990, and 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany was unified. It couldn't have looked that way in 1946. When the Italian communists won 48% of the vote and the French communists won 46% of the vote, the question wasn't would Eastern Europe be communist, it was would Western Europe be communist. And in 48, the Berlin crisis and the birth of Israel, and war breaks out in the Middle East the next day, and the Soviet Union explodes a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule in 1949, and the Chinese communists win. it could not have looked as if we were going to triumph. And so you have to ask what happened. And American leadership happened. The United States of America said, we're not going to return home. We're not going to be terrified by these threats. We are going to insert ourselves right in the middle of these threats. And a pledge through Article 5 of NATO, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. Think of taking that pledge when the Soviet Union was astride half of Europe. We decided we were going to stand for people who needed to live in liberty and freedom. I had the great joy of being trained by Madeleine's father, Joseph Corbell. She'll tell her own story, but the Corbell family would not have survived without the United States of America. So yes, I think the threats are multiple. We can talk about specific tactical and strategic responses to them, but the core has to be, the United States has to be confident enough to say that with our leadership, we can solve the problems that we face. There is nobody else to do it. Anybody else who tries to do it will not do it on the basis of our values. And if we don't work from our values, our interests will be compromised as well.
Secretary Albright?
Well, I do think the threats are as listed, but I also agree with Condi in terms of the role that the United States has to play. I do think this is an incredibly complex time. To use a diplomatic term, the world is a mess. And the bottom line is that the issues are coming from everywhere. And I think Grace Jo's story is so really moving. And I just have to add something. One of the things, I'm an immigrant. And the thing that I liked most of all was to give people their naturalization certificates. Mrs. Bush, your story. And so the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. And I'm giving out naturalization certificates, and this man, I hear him say all of a sudden, can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State. And I went up to him and I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And I really do think that speaks to what America is about. And so, welcome. I am an American, and so are you, so it's great. I do think that the issues are, and I think, Condi, you described them so well. In addition to that, I think we're living in a very different world where the combination of the technology, the interconnectedness of society have created issues where people, it used to be that there always was a division between rich and poor, but the poor didn't always know what the rich had. And so the rapidity of the technology is something that is out there. I do think it is absolutely essential for the United States to lead. And Ambassador Haley, Nikki, you said I could call you, is that I think being at the UN, you can really see that unless the UN speaks, the U.S. speaks at the UN, either at the beginning to start the conversation or at the end to summarize, or sometimes in the middle, nothing happens. And so I am very concerned in terms of how we project our leadership, how we explain to the American people that nothing works without us, and that there are certain sacrifices that have to be made to have that leadership role, but we don't do it alone. The word indispensable, there's nothing about it that says alone. It means engaged. And I think there are incredible challenges out there that you see every day that we used to. But I really do think American leadership in this is absolutely crucial, and how to explain it to the Americans.
Well, and I think I have an interesting story in terms of when I first got there, we obviously had issues, but the one that was really defining was when the president made the decision to hit Syria, and after the chemical weapons. When he made that decision, the number of calls and emails I received from countries saying, it's so good to see America lead again, was amazing. And it was enlightening to me because they felt like we had been dormant, and they really feel weaker when the U.S. doesn't lead. They want to see us speak out. They want us to weigh in. They want us to lead on the international stage. And when we do, they feel more confident. And so I think, you're seeing that whether it's with Japan and South Korea on the North Korea issue, you're seeing that whether it's with the, our Arab partners when we're dealing with Iran, all of those things, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba, I think it's always going to be important for us to know the power of our voice and also know what leadership means to the world.
Can I just pick up on it? Because you also, Nikki,
Yes.
were a governor. And you know America in ways that those of us who hung out in the foreign policy establishment will never know it. And so I think that you're absolutely right about how the world feels when America leads or does not lead. I think what I hope we'll see as the administration progresses, because it's early yet, is there needs to be an overarching narrative about what America is doing. I thought that the strike on Syria was essential. I think that the voice about what is going on in Venezuela and the sanctions on Venezuela, this is a middle-income country where people can't find medicine and food, and you're going to have a refugee crisis in countries that are now stable in the Andean region. And the president said, what Maduro is doing is unacceptable. He is acting anti-democratically. We need, though, a narrative that says human rights, democracy, what happens in other countries matters to us. And if we step back and say we'll leave others to their own devices, we don't have an overarching way of explaining why what we do in Syria or what we do in Venezuela is important. And as a governor, you know that getting that narrative then out to South Carolina or California or Texas ultimately has to happen, because without that, you can't sustain American engagement.
I think it's right. You have to have not only international communication, but the country needs to believe that everything's okay. They need to know their stability. They need to know that we're leading, and they need to know why. And so I think that's very important, that we have to always keep making sure we're in touch with Americans to let them know why we're doing what we're doing overseas.
Secretary Albright, I'm going to turn to you for a moment. We, as you mentioned, we live in a world of new challenges and some new dangers, and some of them we're only beginning to find the right strategies and tools to deal with them. Take, for example, the cyber threat on our financial system, and now we know on our election system. As chair of NDI, you have turned significant attention to this issue, and particularly problems of disinformation. How do we begin to grapple with new challenges like these?
Well, this is part of what makes this era so different. But let me just say, I have always been interested in the role of information and political change. There's always some addition, whether it's the printing press or... And I did my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968. And then I wrote a book about the Polish press under the Wałęsa period. And they're really information, and at that stage, it was cassettes. What happened was Wałęsa would be in one factory and he'd tape it and they'd send it to another one. So there's always something. But what has happened now is the rapidity of the technological spread is just remarkable. And cyber, that we don't fully understand. And what it is that those who don't like us can affect with cyber. Condi was talking about NATO. When on the 60th anniversary of NATO, I was asked to lead a new strategic concept for the new Secretary General. And one of the things we talked about was whether a cyber threat was an Article 5 threat, because Estonia's banking system had been brought down. And at that stage, people were kind of nervous, saying we don't really know the genesis and what do we do. I think now we understand that a cyber threat can bring a state down. There's also the usage of cyber and technology to undermine systems. And one of the things, and as chairman of NDI, I have just come from Georgia and Ukraine. And in Ukraine, I was briefed by people that showed what the Russians had been doing to undermine the system there through fake news. And they were able to penetrate in a number of ways and take a piece of a story and turn it around. So for instance, Ukraine is a very complex country, and the western part during World War II, there were some that worked with the Germans because of what the Soviets had done to them. So all of a sudden, there were stories in the Ukrainian paper about the fact that all of Western Ukraine were Nazis. And so they took pieces of information and pushed it. And I think we have to recognize that we are dealing with a president of a country, of Russia, who is a KGB agent. And they know how to do propaganda. And what they're doing is using information in a way to undermine the system, democracy. What they want to do is undermine the democracies in Europe and separate us from Europe. And I do believe that they have figured out how to make our life more complicated in every single way through various new methods, tweets and bots and various aspects. And we are an open society, and they are using our openness. And how do we deal with it without closing down? So it is a challenge for all of us to think through, but it has changed because we are being attacked in a new way through a new system. And it's very interesting because the Russian chairman of their Joint Chiefs, of their General Staff, Gerasimov, has in fact developed a doctrine about this. It's hybrid warfare, and here their military guy has kind of put it together in the way that they plan to reassert themselves in a variety of places in the world.
Dr. Ice, I'd like to ask you, as Secretary Albright just said, disinformation isn't new, and the mindset behind this disinformation, meaning Putin's worldview, is not new either. Is this simply a case of everything old is new again? Do we need to revive Sovietology? I'm a former, one of the last Sovietology students, or what's different?
Well, we thought we were
We
done
all are.
in Sovietology, but maybe not. I do think that this is an old story, but with very new capacity. And we have to recognize that not only does the cyber world allow you to more rapidly influence, but it allows you to do it in a way that is masked in ways that it was not masked before. You know, I've done some work to look back when I was a student at what some of the Soviet efforts to influence fifth columns and so forth, and actually they were kind of clumsy. And this isn't clumsy. This is highly sophisticated. I will say that I hope we are on top of what really happened to us, that we're really investigating it in ways that bring all of our tools, including what people at places like Google and Apple will, Google and Facebook will know about how this is done. And then we've got to fix it, because my own view is if they do this to us once, it's their fault. If they do this to us twice, it's ours. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so a national effort to figure out what happened here and then to stop it the next time is going to be very important. And Madeleine said the right thing. We have to do it without shutting ourselves down, absolutely. But we need better cooperation between the private sector and the government on this. Sometimes out where I live in the Silicon Valley, people talk about privacy. We all want to protect privacy, but we also want to protect the country. And that conversation is not going on in a very effective way. There's too much suspicion between government and the private sector. And I'll say one other thing. You know, I know the Europeans worry a lot about privacy and some of the things that they believe American intelligence agencies may have done in their countries. But whatever differences we have with the Europeans about privacy pale in comparison to the differences that we have with Russia or China. And so I hope that the Europeans will be a part of this conversation as well.
You know, and I find it fascinating because the Russians, God bless them, they're saying, why are Americans anti-Russian and why have we done the sanctions? Well, don't interfere in our elections and we won't be anti-Russian. And I think we have to be so hard on this and we have to hold them accountable and we have to get the private sector to understand they are responsible for this too. We all have to step up from this event. We can't just assume that that's going to happen again. And I will tell you that when a country can come interfere in another country's elections, that is warfare. It really is, because you're making sure that the democracy shifts from what the people want to giving out that misinformation. And we didn't just see it here. You can look at France and you can look at other countries. They are doing this everywhere. This is their new weapon of choice. And we have to make sure we get in front of it. And I can tell you our intelligence agencies are working overtime now because there's just so much when it comes to cyber threats that we have that we're having to deal with.
I will just say from the Silicon Valley perspective, I think that these companies are recognizing now this responsibility. And this is the time then for a kind of quiet national conversation. I won't say national conversation because I don't want to see it on the front pages of the New York Times, but I hope that people are reaching across these boundaries. I think there's a willingness to have that conversation that was not there even a few months ago, because this Russian effort has really gotten people's attention in the way that nothing else did.
But I think also we have to be very protective of our press. The U.S., our democracy depends on having a free press, people that are able to go out and cover stories as they want to, and really not undermine the importance of the press in this country, because we are an example. And by the way, one of the things just generally in terms of, Mrs. Bush, you were talking about Freedom House and what's been happening in other places. I think that what's happened with NDI, when we're out abroad talking to people about the importance of compromise and work, the parliament's working with their executive branch and how they can work better. And they look at me and they say, you mean like you guys at this point? So we are not, we need to remember that we're an example with our press, with our institutional structures. I think that's very important.
So let's turn to part two, and that is coming back to the question about the imperative of American leadership. Actually, it is no question. So I recently saw an email exchange where someone quipped that in Washington, D.C., there are no less than 8 dozen conversations going on right now about the future of the liberal democratic order. So we're going to start another one here today. Secretary Albright, what do you think about this sense, now years in the making, that the liberal democratic order formed in the wake of World War II is at risk? Is that order still relevant? What's the role of American leadership today?
I think the order is definitely still relevant because I believe that we're all the same and people want to be living in societies where they can make their decisions and be respected for them. And I never like the fact that people say, people in X country are not ready for democracy. Everybody is. It evolves in different ways. And I think, I have to say, I always sound so kind of sentimental, but I'm so proud to be an American because of the things that we've done, and especially if you've come to this country because of wanting to live in freedom. And I think that the question, however, is how do we explain what we're doing and how important it is to talk about the resiliency of democracy and that the strength of democracy is that we can correct our mistakes. But it does require us to have honest conversations and to say, okay, for whatever reason, one election turns out one way. Why did it happen? What was the interference by the Russians? What was it that we missed about how the liberal order needs to operate? And in fact, that it is based on respect for other people's views. And so I think it's more important than ever for the United States to act in a leadership role on this. And I really would like to thank President and Mrs. Bush for doing this because I think it's a very important message. And I'm very proud to be a part of your system here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Haley, you've been at the United Nations for 9 months now. The UN was formed in response to World War II, and its charter affirms human freedom and rule of law and aspires to progress and prosperity. Does the liberal democratic order have traction at the UN today, and how do you assert that?
What I tried to do at the United Nations was just give a strong voice to America. And I think the biggest surprise that I saw were the ambassadors there at the UN. They're not just figures that were sent. They each are the most trusted person that their president knew they could send, and they have their direct ear. So negotiations can actually happen at the UN. I can go and try and negotiate something, and they literally can get on the phone with their president, and we can start moving foreign policy. And so what I have found is the United Nations is the center of the universe for every other country. And so what my job is to show the American people why it matters to us, what the role of the United Nations can be, how we can make it more effective. And I think what we found is we're showing strength at the United Nations through the power of our voice, but also through the negotiations and then communicating what we want to see happen. The U.S. has led and will always lead, but if you look at the rest of the world, as much as we worry about the threats and the chaos that seems to be there, it's still in a better place than it was years ago. So it's improving slowly over time. It's just different issues and different threats that come up. And so I think it's important for us to use every avenue, whether it's NATO, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's any of those, and always make sure that we are not doing things alone. We're doing them together with other countries, but we're showing the power of our voice in the process.
I have to say, you just said something, Nikki, which is there are people who think that the ambassadors at the UN just go up and go to receptions and do nothing. And the bottom line is, it is the opposite. And I found when I got there that the people were either, they were high-level people in their own governments, and they acted from that perspective, and everybody works really hard, and you see more foreigners than any other diplomat, and being able to do that is so important in America's voice. But there are receptions, but they are working receptions.
They're those fun receptions, right? So,
Madeleine, those of us in Washington never thought that about
No, I know that.
Oh, no. The liberal order, I think, is actually a bit in trouble And I think the principles are still extremely important. And so what was it? It was, we believed in an international economy that was not zero-sum game. So the protectionism of the period between the First World War and the Second World War had led to a Great Depression, beggar thy neighbor trading policies. And so the people who found themselves in leadership after World War II said, not again. And they believed that with a free trading system, we could build prosperity for everybody, not a zero-sum game. Then there wouldn't be conflict and competition over resources and markets. We would compete, but it wouldn't be conflictual. Secondly, they believed in free peoples. We forget that when Germany and Japan were rebuilt, people feared that Germany and Japan would again rise and threaten their neighborhoods. So what did we say? No, if they're rebuilt as democracies, democracies don't fight one another, and there is something called the democratic peace that political scientists have demonstrated. Democracies don't fight one another, particularly mature democracies. And third, they counted on American military power to protect the whole thing. Now, you know, there are challenges to that. There are questions about whether the benefits of free trade have been evenly spread in our economy. That's a good question. But we have to recognize that the system really did create an awful lot of prosperity. And so without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we've got to find a way to reaffirm that. But I think what the international order needed most was patience. And that's what I most see lacking. It took a long time to defeat the Soviet Union. But we did it on the basis of our own model prosperity draw and on the basis of our values, and we stayed the course. Through multiple administrations of different parties, we stayed the course. I always use the following example. People say, well, you can't do anything about the Russian annexation of Crimea, right? Maybe not in the short term. But for more than 40 years, we refused to accept the forcible incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I was the specialist of Soviet affairs for President George H.W. Bush on the NSC. And I had a stamp on my desk. And whenever you mentioned Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, you stamped it with, the United States does not recognize the forcible incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We stood for what was right, even if we couldn't do anything about it immediately. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we've never had better friends than Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so it takes patience, it takes recognizing that democracy takes time. Who are we as Americans to say, well, they just can't get it right? As I stood in front of that portrait of Ben Franklin as President Bush swore me in, I had to remember that the first American Constitution counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. And yet there I was, taking an oath of an office to that Constitution in front of old Ben Franklin, sworn in by a Jewish woman Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because the values and the institutions eventually got that piece of it more right than not. And so this democratic effort is a long-term effort, and sometimes I think one of your hardest problems is explaining to the American people and maybe even to the administration, this can be hard inside, as Madeleine and I will tell you, that these things take time.
These things take time. They also have taken, over the course of 70+ years, bipartisanship. There was a sense during the Cold War of bipartisanship in our U.S. foreign policy. Certainly there were points of disagreement, and sometimes big ones, but there was a certain unity of vision and continuity. Was that real? Sometimes people say that wasn't real. Was that real, and can it live on today, and how? I'll turn that to Albright
I
first.
really do believe it was real, and it needs to be. You can imagine that I worked very closely with Chairman Jesse Helms, and it was very important that we did that. It was through that we were able to have a bipartisan foreign policy, do expansion of NATO, any number of different things. I now am counting on bipartisanship in terms of funding democracy programs. Lindsey Graham is my best friend, and I think that it has been very important to make sure that the budget of the State Department and the various programs are funded bipartisanly because it is about American leadership. And so I think that it is important, and I've just done a lot of work with Steve Hadley, and I believe in bipartisanship. So, and it is essential. It is what America's about, which is why when we go abroad and we deal with opposition parties, to tell them that there are various issues that they have to work on together.
And I think it's bipartisan now. I think if you look at the way both parties strongly support what we're doing with North Korea and how we move forward in protecting it, the way that they look at our military and making sure that we're defending our military, building up our military, all of those things, what we've done with Venezuela. I mean, there's a lot of the focus on ISIS in Syria and Iraq and how we've been able to defeat them and how we're moving forward on all of those things. There is a lot of bipartisan support. And I can tell you in reference to the funding, what we've tried to do is really talk about what works and what doesn't work. You know, what can we improve on, what's absolutely necessary, and we can build off of that, and then what is just not working. You know, we just got out of UNESCO, and you look at UNESCO and it wasn't defining America's values. You know, they had Assad on their Human Rights Committee. I mean, that in itself, you look at that, and the anti-Israel bias and all of these other things, and then you're saying, all right, why are taxpayer dollars going towards that? And we couldn't justify it anymore. And so you look at those types of things, because a deal happens, whether it's in a previous administration or not, it doesn't mean a previous administration was right or wrong, because you have to go back and reevaluate every program and say, is it still working? And that shouldn't be seen as an offense to a previous administration. It should be seen as America moving and changing, and we have to be able to change with it in order to keep us prosperous.
I agree with the need to make sure things are working. The American taxpayer has to be assured that the tax dollars are being well spent. I would say that when you take on what's not working, always affirm what is.
Right.
And so one of the questions that I think is out there, and it's sort of the elephant in the room, is will you affirm the things that clearly have worked? So if you ask most Americans how much of the national budget goes to foreign assistance, they'll give you wild numbers, 20, 25%. We all know that depending on how you count it, it's either less than 1% or 1.5%, depending on what you count. Now, if you look at a couple of signature programs that President Bush launched and that President Obama either kept or extended, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Everybody says worldwide, we saved millions and millions and millions of lives. If you look at global health issues like women's cancers, we've saved lives. Malaria, we've saved lives. If you look at the Millennium Challenge, where we are actually saying to countries, you have got to be governing wisely, fighting corruption, investing in your people, or you will not get a grant from the United States of America. And oh, by the way, we'll take it away if you stop doing that, as we did with Nicaragua. That's something that could be affirmed tomorrow because there's plenty of testimony about how it's worked. So I've been, a budget officer as Stanford's provost, and as Secretary of State, I paid a lot of attention to the state budget, and I made people defend those programs every year. But it's awfully important when you're saying we're going to stop doing some things, and UNESCO, you won't get an argument from me, but you have to affirm the things that have worked too, because when you lead with what doesn't work, that's all people hear at home and abroad. And so I would just hope that it could be recalibrated to talk about all the things that work. And if I could just mention one other thing, when we talk about democracy promotion, I prefer the word democracy support because people think that when we say democracy support or democracy promotion, we mean Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I would never have gone to the President of the United States and said, Mr. President, we ought to use American military power to bring democracy to Iraq. That wasn't the idea. We had a security issue, perhaps with not as good intelligence as we would like. Maybe it wasn't the security issue that we thought it was. We certainly had a security issue in Afghanistan where those safe havens were being used to attack the United States, and after 9/11, we had to get rid of them. So we had security issues. Once we had overthrown those dictatorships, we then had to say, what are we going to leave behind? And we believed that we were better to try to help the Iraqis and the Afghans build stable democracies. And by the way, I would still rather be the Iraqi than Syrian today. Now, most of democracy support and promotion, though, isn't that complicated. It is helping women's groups to find their voice in Kuwait. It is helping people to do election support and monitoring, which NDI and IRI, the Republican side of it, do in places that are having elections and want to make sure that they're free and fair. It's supporting a free press. It's supporting civil society. I met a woman in Russia a few years ago when we were there, a woman who was of limited sight. And she recognized that the Soviet Union and Russia had a long history of just tossing disabled people on the streets because they didn't somehow exemplify the greatness of the country. She actually went to Vladimir Putin and said, we've got to be better than that. And USAID supported her little non-governmental organization doing support for disabled people in Russia. That's what we do. And I hope that as we think about what doesn't work, we really look at what does.
And, you know, I think that it's a perfect example if you look back at the Africa policy during the Bush administration. I'm going to Africa on Saturday, the president's sending me, because we want to build it back up to what it was. It has fallen, and our African friends feel that. And so we look at PEPFAR, and we look at all of those programs where we went and helped them build up their economies and all those things. We want to get that back to where it is. But I think that, you know, there really needs to be a clarification on the budget situation with what happened. I was a governor, and when you have an executive budget, you lay out ideas, and you lay out the direction you want to go. You don't expect it to be set in stone. So when the president laid out this budget, it was just his conversation point. He was starting a conversation, and the conversation he wanted to start was, we need to build up our military. We need to update our nuclear programs. We need to make sure that we are prepared to take on any threat that America comes. The fact that the State Department was brought down to a bottom level was not the fact, oh, gut the State Department in the process. It was, this is my priority. And whatever you do, make sure that this is my priority. So when I testified before Congress, what we told them was, look, when it comes to peacekeeping issues, these are very important. We're doing these, but we're also looking at the peacekeeping issues. The budget, we had been spending 28% in funding the UN, but what we saw was every challenge that came up, they were throwing more peacekeepers at it, but they were never checking to see if they were trained. They didn't make sure they had the equipment. If we're gonna do something, do it smart, do it right. And so we've cut off $700 million of the peacekeeping budget at the UN, but we didn't cut helping people. We made them smarter, we made them better, we made the quality of those programs good. And so the same with every program at the State Department. What I'm trying to do is bridge between the president and Congress on, okay, what is really working that we don't want to gut, and what is frivolous that we do want to cut. And I think that Condi's right. We need to make sure we're always talking about what works and what's really good. And I think a perfect example was, if you saw the United Nations and you saw a high-level week, you saw a massive U.S. representation. You saw the president and the vice president and the first lady. You saw General McMaster. You saw General Kelly. You saw so many of the U.S. delegation going because they see value now in the United Nations. They see what it can do. They see the meetings that can happen and the negotiations that can happen. So I think this is a learning process for the administration as much as it's a learning process for the public, but I think we need to give each other the benefit of the doubt as we go forward.
Nikki, I think you're going to see the following problem. If funding for the United Nations is cut and you go and try to work on reform, you are not going to be listened to because you don't have the leverage. It happened to me because Congress unilaterally cut the amount of money that was going to go to the UN. It led our best friends, the British, in the General Assembly to deliver a line they had waited more than 200 years to say, representation without taxation. And so it's very hard to have any leverage. So that's part of it. The other part, I do believe that we need a strong military, but the difference between the budget for the Pentagon, over $600 billion, close, and for the State Department, under $50 billion at the moment, is crazy. We do not have a lot of tools, and it is necessary to have a functioning diplomatic service and to have people, if you're going to, talking about North Korea, to have people that are really out there And President Trump is going on a very complicated trip at the moment. And there are not enough people in the diplomatic system to be supportive. So I'm worried about that. And I have to say this, I agree with you. I don't like democracy promotion. I think you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. What you have to do is have a support system, and what I'm very proud of that NDI does is elections, but also support for the rule of law, civil society, getting women into office over the world. And by the way, the National Democratic Institute and the Republican Institute was created by Ronald Reagan. Right. And so the issue is, and nation building is not a four-letter word. I think the bottom line is, it is in the really the advantage of the country that we're doing it, but it's better for America because we will, as you said, Connie, democracies don't fight each other. And I'm very proud of something we did, which was to create the community of democracies, which was to meet and share best practices and try to figure out how to support each other. So those are the kinds of tools that are out there that are not, I know it's new, I know what it's like to take over, but I think that there are things out there that the Trump administration could really use to strengthen America by strengthening our friends and allies.
And I think Congress has been helpful because I think what they've tried to do is really see the fact that that conversation was happening and say, okay, how can we do this? So on the peacekeeping, what you're going to see is it was at 28%. U.S. law says it's supposed to be at 25. So I've asked them to move it to 25, but it's still going to be at 25, and that's fair. We need to make sure that we keep things fair and in a good place. So we're not going to see things gutted. We're not. I mean, that's just the reality of it because we can't, and the president doesn't want to. But what we do want to say is, can we have a conversation on everything we're doing from a foreign policy standpoint internationally and make sure it is still in the best interest of the United States? And I think that's what you're seeing us try to do.
In the few minutes that we have left, I want to turn to one of the very important audiences for this conversation and this entire event, and that is the American people. We've often been described as reluctant internationalists, and I'd like to talk a bit about how do we make the case to the American people today for strong, active U.S. leadership in the world. What are the arguments? What are the proof points that need to be different? And maybe we'll use one example about free trade. Ambassador Haley, I'll start with you. As governor of South Carolina, you were a champion of global economic engagement. Some data indicate that a quarter of the state's workforce is now supported by global enterprise. How do we communicate to the American people that active trade and strong engagement has positive benefits for the country as a whole, but as individuals and as families? And what can we do better to support those who are adversely affected by globalization, by changes in technology? We'll start with you, but I'd like to ask that of the entire
I think you asked the
panel.
people of South Carolina because they're overjoyed. We now have 5 international tire companies. We have 3 international auto companies. And what you see is when we manufacture, when we get companies to come into the country and manufacture, everyone wins. Our economies get better, we have more people going to work, we see everything start to improve. And so as I recruited companies in, South Carolinians just felt the strength of what was happening. And I think Americans know that. I think what they want to see is, yes, we want to see more businesses do business in our country, but they just don't want to see us as being taken for granted. And I think in a lot of cases like South Carolina, you can talk to them and they'll tell you it's absolutely worth it. And the way I saw it as governor was either we can create the jobs in South Carolina or those jobs are going overseas, and I'd much rather have them in South Carolina than not. And that was the goal of recruiting international companies in and getting them to go and help us with our economy.
How do we create that in other states?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely. And my home state, Alabama, is another state that is very dependent. Actually, the German car makers there are the most prolific in terms of employers, other than a couple of local companies. The problem is if you start to talk about renationalization, though, other people might decide to renationalize. So you can't say on the one hand, let's bring those factories back from Mexico or back from Canada to the United States because we're going to produce here, and then tell the Germans, oh, produce in Alabama. And so the free trade narrative can't be, I think, broken into pieces. We want to have foreign companies here, but we don't actually want to have plants in foreign countries. And I think that's a little bit of the confusion right now. And so trying to say to the American people, the reason the system works is that people can locate their production in various places, and we're getting our fair share of that in places like South Carolina and Alabama. But if I could make just one other point, you ask, what do we have to say to the American people? We do have to recognize, I'm a believer in globalization and free trade, but there are places that have not benefited. And most of it's automation, that is true. But it is also true that there are people who don't have the skills to keep up with a globalizing economy. It is absolutely true that there are people who look out at globalization and say that's a threat. So how do you address them? And I'll just make 3 quick points. I know you're going to have a panel on the domestic side, but I'm an educator. And that's really my profession. First of all, don't have any more third graders who can't read. That's right. And so the K-12 education issue is a national security problem. Secondly, don't have 18 and 19-year-olds who go to college, come out with debt and no marketable skills. And third, do something about 35-year-olds who have to be retrained. Because what's happening is Americans aren't so confident anymore that they can compete in this globalizing economy. We used to have supreme confidence that if the economic rules were fair, we would win our fair share. Now, I think the president is right to look at where those rules are not fair. He's right to look at some of the practices that China engages in. But when you're doing that, let's remember that if America is prepared, America can compete. And we've really benefited from a system in which we were allowed to compete.
I find very hard to talk about trade as kind of a zero-sum game here. It has to be reciprocal and fair and all that. What I am troubled by is that we are acting all the time as woe is me, America's in trouble, and everybody's taking advantage of us. And I think that is not healthy. First of all, it's not true. And second, it's not the kind of attitude that we need to have and that we gain from trade. You've been talking about that. But I have to say the following. I also am kind of your wonky internationalist, but I worked for Ed Muskie, and one of the things that he was chairman of the Shoe Caucus, and because I was his chief legislative assistant, I became the empress of the Shoe Caucus, and the only thing I knew about shoes was that I wore them. And so he sent me up to Maine to talk to people at the Dexter Shoe Company, and you get there, and these people, it's exactly, didn't have the skills, didn't want to move, but the interesting part was there was, whether it was a Walmart or something up there, they shopped there and bought cheaper goods. And the question is whether workers are only workers or are they also consumers, because they want to have that kind of exchange. And so I do think it has to be reciprocal. And I hope that comes, we can't tear down all the trade agreements. I happened to have been in Mexico about 3 months ago, and there was a change of mind in terms of what was happening on NAFTA. We have confused our partners and friends in terms of the direction that we want to go in trade. And part of the problem has to do with automation that has nothing to do with trade. And some of it does have to do, I so agree, Condi, on the educational issue. And I do think that we can't keep thinking that the United States is pathetic and that we're in trouble. We are not in trouble. We need to lead, and we can lead from a position of strength with partners, is the way I see it.
Ambassador Haley, would you like to respond?
You know, I think that, first of all, I will never say this country is pathetic, and I would never want anybody to think that. You know, I'm the daughter of parents who came here and reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to live in this country. I am the wife of a military veteran who fought in Afghanistan. So I want us to always be very proud of our country. But I do think when we have these trade agreements, there's nothing wrong with going back and looking at them. There's nothing wrong with seeing if we can make them better. So I don't see us tearing up any deals. If that was the case, we would have done it already. I do see the fact that, you know, this is an administration who said, let's go back and look and see, can we make it better? That's the overall theme I hear in this administration. They're constantly saying, can we make it better? In some cases, we can't make it better. In a lot of cases, we can. And I think that we have to look at that. I do absolutely agree with Condi in the fact that education is key. I saw it in South Carolina. So one of the companies we recruited was an international bicycle company from China. So in South Carolina, they're making the first American-made bicycles. It went to this small town of just a few hundred people that hadn't seen any sort of business in years. And they suddenly saw that. So they saw what it did. They saw the greatness of it. And those are the stories we have to tell.
And if I could just, the other reason that you have to be careful about the rhetoric as you're looking at what you're, there can be a reaction in other countries too.
Yeah.
We sometimes think we only speak to our audience and they don't hear it abroad. There are populists growing in places like Mexico that say, all right, if that's the game you're going to play, then elect me and I'll play that game tougher than you could ever play in America. And so it's having an effect of, I think, reinforcing this, I call them the four horses of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. They tend to ride together. And so when we use that language, even for very good reason, that sometimes we do need to look at the agreements, we have to remember that others start to react, and not necessarily in ways that will benefit us.
Well, the clock tells me that we are out of time. I'm so grateful to the three of you for your leadership and for your time. Thank you very much.